The shuttle's engines hummed a quiet, steady rhythm as the human soldier stared out of the small viewing window. His hands were clenched tightly around the seat, as if holding on to something he could control. Below, the planet of Zalia's people came into view, a world of lush forests, glowing rivers, and ancient stone cities. It was all so familiar, and yet he felt like a stranger. He had returned from the mission that had kept him away for so long, a mission that had been meant to bring peace, to show humanity's strength and diplomacy and unity. But the truth was that it had been more of an excuse, a way to run from the life he had once thought he wanted. His mind wandered back to that fateful day, years ago, when he had left her standing at the altar. Princess Zalia, her name echoed in his mind like a constant reminder. Beautiful, powerful, and the future queen of her people, Zalia had been everything he thought he wanted. Their marriage had been arranged, but there had been a time when he had believed in it. There had been a time when he had looked forward to a future with her by his side. But then, when the moment came, the moment that could have changed everything, he had hesitated. Fear had gripped him. Fear of being tied to a woman he barely knew. Fear of losing himself in a life of political games and royal duties. His heart had raced, not with excitement, but with dread. And without a word, he had fled. He remembered the look on Zalia's face. Shocked, confused, hurt. That expression had haunted him for months. And even now, as he stared out at the planet, it still felt like a weight on his chest. He hadn't returned to Earth after that. No, he had been sent on one mission after another, hoping that each one would offer a distraction, a way to forget. But as the days stretched into years, the memory of Zalia never faded, and now, as he entered her world once again, he had no idea how to face her. The shuttle's descent slowed, and the towering spires of the royal city came into view. The golden towers gleamed in the sunlight, their reflection shimmering in the waters below. He could already feel the tension in the air, the pressure of returning to a place where he had once been expected to be a part of something much bigger than himself. The sound of the shuttle's engines began to quiet as the craft neared the landing zone. He hadn't expected to come back. Not like this. It was supposed to be different. He was supposed to be different. But now that he was here, a part of him knew it was time to face the consequences of his actions. The peace mission had ended, and this was the moment of reckoning. There was no escaping what he had done, no running from the past anymore. The shuttle landed with a soft thud, and the ramp extended with a low hiss. The air outside was thick, warm, and smelled faintly of the alien flora that had become the symbol of Zalia's people. He stepped off the craft and was greeted by a group of royal guards, their stern faces giving nothing away. They had been ordered to escort him directly to the palace, and they did not speak as they led him through the winding streets of the capital. The city was alive with the sounds of life, people walking, shops bustling, and the distant hum of energy fields. But the soldier couldn't help but feel like an intruder in a place that should have felt like home. As they approached the palace, memories from that day resurfaced. The grand hall, the priests, the ceremony that had been prepared for months. He had been ready to pledge his life to Zalia, to serve her people as her husband. But instead, he had left her standing there, alone, abandoned. The palace gates loomed ahead, the towering structures made of shining, alien stone that seemed to shimmer under the twin suns. As they passed through the gates, the soldier could feel the eyes of the people on him, curiosity mixed with judgment. He could see the whispers in the crowd, the stares of disapproval, and it made his heart race. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was colder than he remembered. The grand halls were dimly lit, with towering statues of ancient kings and queens that stood like silent sentinels watching over the land. The air felt heavy with the weight of centuries of rule, and for the first time, the soldier wondered if he had made a mistake in returning. But it was too late now. He was led through a maze of corridors until they reached a large, ornate door. The guard stopped there, standing in silence as the soldier approached. His throat was dry, his hands sweaty. He didn't know what to expect. Was she still the same? Had time changed her? Or had the anger of the past years hardened her, turned her into someone he no longer recognized? The door opened with a quiet creak, and he stepped into the royal chamber. The room was vast, with high ceilings and walls lined with tapestries depicting the history of Zalia's people. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Princess Zalia herself. She was just as he remembered, though different in a way. The soft elegance of her movements had turned into the confident stride of a ruler. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now held the coolness of someone who had learned the price of leadership and betrayal. Her royal armor gleamed in the dim light, and the intricate designs of her gown spoke of the power she now wielded. Zalia's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the shared weight of the past between them. She didn't say anything at first, merely watching him, assessing him, as if he were a stranger who had walked into her life uninvited. Finally, she spoke, her voice cold and distant. "You returned." He tried to find the words, but they were caught in his throat. He had spent years wondering what he would say to her when he finally came back, but now, standing in front of her, none of those words seemed to matter. I'm sorry," he managed to say, his voice rough. Zalia took a step forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Sorry?" she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief.
Sorry for what, exactly? For abandoning me when I needed you the most?
For leaving me to face everything alone? He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting her eyes again.
I didn't know what I was doing. I was scared. I thought I had to run, that I wasn't ready for the life you had planned for us. Zalia's lips curled into a small, almost humorless smile. You weren't ready? You think I was? Her eyes flickered with a mixture of anger and something softer, something that caught him off guard. I wasn't ready either. But I did what I had to do to keep my people safe, to keep my kingdom strong. The words stung, but he didn't flinch. He knew she was right. He had been a coward. And now, after all these years, he was standing in front of the woman he had once promised to love and protect, knowing that she had moved on without him. I've changed, he said, his voice quiet. I know that doesn't fix what I did, but I want to help. I want to make things right. Zalia stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched heavy and thick before she spoke again, her voice low and firm. The past is gone. What matters now is what you do in the present. If you think you can walk back into my life and fix everything, you are wrong. His heart sank. Then what do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to see if you truly understand the cost of your actions, Zalia replied. And I want you to prove you're not the man who left me behind. She turned her back on him then, the long, flowing fabric of her gown trailing behind her like a shadow. I'll give you a chance, but know this. You will have to earn my trust. And trust isn't given lightly. With that, she dismissed him, her words hanging in the air like a final sentence. The soldier stood there for a moment longer, feeling the sting of her rejection, but also the small spark of hope that perhaps, in time, he could prove himself worthy. And so he left the room, knowing that the road ahead would be long, filled with trials, and most likely failure. But he also knew one thing for sure. He would do whatever it took to make amends, even if it meant facing the harsh reality of his past. The soldier left the grand chamber, his heart heavy with the weight of Zalia's words. The echoes of her dismissal followed him down the long corridors of the royal palace, each step feeling like a reminder of how far he had fallen from grace. The air felt colder now, as if the very walls were closing in around him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one fighting for attention. Zalia had given him a chance. But what kind of chance was it? She had told him to prove himself. But how could he do that? He had failed her once, left her at the altar without a second thought. He had abandoned everything they could have had, and now she was asking him to earn her trust. The idea of earning trust seemed impossible. How could he make up for what he had done? Was there even a way to make things right? The soldier walked aimlessly through the palace halls, his mind still spinning. The ornate tapestries on the walls, the flickering torches, the marble floors, all of it felt foreign to him now, like a world he no longer belonged to. He had left all of this behind, choosing duty over love, and now he was back, standing in the ruins of what might have been. His footsteps slowed as he reached a balcony that overlooked the palace grounds. Below, the garden stretched out, lush and vibrant, the bright colors of alien flowers swaying gently in the breeze. It was a beautiful sight, but it did nothing to ease the storm inside him. He placed his hands on the railing, staring out into the vast expanse, trying to clear his mind. But the image of Zalia, standing before him with that cold, distant expression, lingered. For a moment, he allowed himself to think back to their past. He remembered the first time he had met her. An arranged marriage, yes, but there had been a time when he had truly believed in it. Zalia had been everything he had thought he wanted in a partner. She was strong, intelligent, and her beauty was unmatched. He had admired her from the moment they met, but as the wedding day approached, doubts had begun to creep in. Fear had taken root in his heart, and instead of confronting it, he had run. Now, all these years later, he had returned, only to face a woman who had transformed into a leader, a ruler who had no time for the mistakes of the past. The soldier closed his eyes, his fingers tightening around the railing. He had been a fool to leave her. But how could he fix it? How could he undo the damage he had caused? The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see a figure approaching him from the hallway. It was one of the royal guards, her expression as stoic as ever. She stopped a few feet away, bowing her head respectfully. "Your presence is requested in the royal council chambers," she said, her voice calm and impersonal. The soldier nodded silently, following her down the winding halls. As they walked, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had come back to this place thinking he could somehow make amends, but now he realized that it wouldn't be as simple as showing up and asking for forgiveness. Zalia was no longer the woman he had left behind. She had grown stronger, more capable, and more distant. They arrived at the council chambers, where several high-ranking officials were already gathered. The room was large, with a high ceiling and a long, polished table at the center. Zalia was seated at the head of the table, her regal presence commanding attention as she looked over the gathered counselors. The soldier entered the room and immediately felt the tension in the air. All eyes turned to him, and he could see the judgment in their gazes. He was the one who had abandoned their princess, the one who had left her to carry the burden of leadership alone. He could feel their disdain, and it made him feel small, insignificant. Zalia's gaze was icy as she motioned for him to approach. The soldier stepped forward, standing before her, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, waiting for her to speak. "Do you know why you are here?" Zalia's voice was cold, but it held an edge of authority that made the soldier's stomach tighten. He swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, Your Highness," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I came back to help, to make things right." Zalia leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable.
"Make things right?" she repeated, her lips curling into a small, almost mocking smile. "You think you can just return and fix everything you broke?" The word stung, but the soldier didn't flinch.
He had expected this.
"I know I can't fix everything," he said quietly.
"But I can try. I can offer my help in any way that I can, if you'll allow it." There was a long pause as Zalia studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. She didn't speak at first, but the weight of her gaze was enough to make the soldier feel like he was under a microscope. He knew she was calculating, weighing whether or not to give him a chance. Finally, she spoke, her tone as sharp as ever. "We have a rebellion on our hands. The situation is critical, and we cannot afford to waste time on the past." She paused, her eyes flicking briefly to the counselors before returning to the soldier. "However," she continued, her voice softening just a fraction, "if you truly wish to prove yourself, then I have a task for you." The soldier straightened, a glimmer of hope flickering in his chest. "What do you need me to do?" Zelia stood from her chair, her movements graceful but purposeful. She gestured for the counselors to step aside as she walked toward the soldier. "There is a rebel faction operating in the outskirts of the kingdom. They are gaining power, and we must neutralize them before they threaten the stability of the entire region." She paused for a moment, her eyes locking with his. "You will lead a mission to infiltrate their ranks and gather information. We need to know who is behind this rebellion, and we need to act quickly." The soldier nodded, his heart racing. It wasn't the kind of task he had hoped for, but it was a start, a way to prove himself. "I'll do it," he said firmly. Zelia's gaze softened just a touch, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, something that reminded him of the woman he had once known. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cool, calculating leader he now faced. "Good," she said, her voice steady once again. "You leave tomorrow at first light. The fate of this kingdom and your future depends on your success." The soldier bowed his head, a mix of determination and anxiety swirling within him. This was his chance to make things right, to prove to Zelia and to himself that he was not the man he had been when he left her behind. But as he turned to leave the council chambers, a question lingered in his mind. Would it be enough? Could he really earn her trust again? Or was this mission just another step in a long, lonely path of redemption? The soldier stood at the edge of the royal palace, staring out across the vast expanse of land that stretched before him. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the alien landscape. He had spent most of the day preparing for the mission, gathering his gear and going over the details with the few soldiers who had been assigned to him. It was a critical mission, perhaps the most important one he had ever been given, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to Zelia, her face, her eyes, the way she had looked at him in the council chambers. It had been a long time since he had seen her, really seen her, and now, standing on the brink of this mission, he couldn't help but feel the pull of the past. He had made so many mistakes, left her behind when she needed him the most, and now he was trying to earn back the trust he had thrown away. But could he really do it? Could he really prove himself to her? The night air was cool as it swept through the palace grounds, rustling the leaves of the alien trees that dotted the landscape. He took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, trying to clear his mind. The rebellion was still a mystery. He had only been given vague details, but nothing concrete. Whoever was behind it, they had to be stopped. If Zelia's kingdom was to remain stable, this threat had to be neutralized, and quickly. He glanced down at the small map he had been given earlier. It outlined the locations of several rebel camps in the outskirts of the kingdom, areas known for their rugged terrain and dense forests. His task was simple: infiltrate the camps, gather intel, and find out who was leading the rebellion. He was given little information about the rebel leaders, only that they were a group of disgruntled citizens and former soldiers who had turned against the crown. He had no idea how many of them there were, or what kind of resources they had at their disposal. All he knew was that failure was not an option. As he turned to head back inside, his mind returned once again to Zelia. He could still remember the way she had stood in front of him, her regal posture unyielding, her eyes cold and unforgiving. It had been hard to meet her gaze, knowing how much he had hurt her, but she had given him a chance to prove himself, a chance to make things right. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, and he turned to see one of the palace guards approaching. The soldier stopped a few feet away, bowing his head slightly in respect. "Your Highness has requested your presence," the guard said, his voice as stoic as ever. The soldier nodded, his stomach tightening. He had hoped that Zalia would come to him before he left to say something. Anything. But he had not expected it. He followed the guard through the winding corridors of the palace, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets that lined the floors. The air inside the palace was cool, and the dimly lit hallways only added to the feeling of isolation. It was as if the walls were closing in on him, reminding him that he was alone in this. When they reached the royal chamber, the guard stepped aside, and the soldier entered the room. Zalia was standing by the window, her back to him, her eyes fixed on the view beyond. The light from the setting sun bathed her in a soft glow, making her seem almost ethereal, but the soldier knew better. Beneath that beauty was a ruler who had the weight of an entire kingdom on her shoulders, a ruler who had been betrayed by the very person she had trusted. Zalia turned slowly, her eyes meeting his as she took a step forward. She looked as regal as ever, her armor gleaming in the dim light. The intricate designs of her clothing, a testament to the strength and power she now wielded. The soldier could see the sharpness in her gaze, the quiet authority that radiated from her. She was no longer the young woman he had known, full of hopes and dreams for their future. She was a leader, hardened by the trials of the past few years, and he was just a man who had come back to try to fix his mistakes. "You leave tomorrow," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something beneath it, a flicker of something that the soldier couldn't quite place. "Yes," the soldier replied, his voice quiet. "I'll leave first thing in the morning." Zalia stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. The soldier nodded without hesitation. "I'm ready. I won't fail." Zalia's expression remained neutral, but there was a moment of something softer in her gaze. For just a second he thought he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, something that reminded him of the woman he had once known. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the calm, calculated expression of a ruler. "I'll be watching," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make me regret giving you this chance." The soldier bowed his head in acknowledgement, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. "I won't," he promised. With that, she turned away from him, walking back toward the window. The soldier stood there for a moment longer, watching her, trying to read the emotions behind her carefully composed expression, but it was no use. Zalia had become a master of masking her feelings, and he was no longer the man who could see through her walls. As he left the room, the silence felt louder than ever. The corridors of the palace seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking him farther from the woman he had once loved, and closer to the mission that lay ahead. He knew what he had to do. He had to prove himself, not just to Zalia, but to himself. He had to show that he was capable of more than just running away. The next morning the soldier stood at the palace gates, his pack slung over his shoulder, and his weapons at the ready. The sun had barely risen, and the air was still cool from the night. His team of soldiers stood behind him, ready for the mission ahead. They had all been briefed on the situation, but none of them seemed particularly eager to venture into the heart of the rebellion. The atmosphere was tense, and the soldier could sense the unease in the air. There was no telling what they would face in the rebel camps, no way to know if they would make it out alive. "Ready?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice rough with the early morning chill. The soldier nodded, checking his gear. One last time. Ready. With that, they began their journey toward the outskirts of the kingdom, where the rebel camps were rumored to be hiding. The landscape was unfamiliar to the soldier, but he had learned quickly during his time in Zalia's kingdom that it was a land of contrasts. The beautiful, peaceful cities of the royal court stood in stark contrast to the wild, untamed forests that lay beyond. and it was in these forests that the rebels had made their home. The journey was long, the rugged terrain making it difficult to keep up a fast pace. The soldier's mind was constantly on the task at hand. He had to find the rebel leader, gather the necessary intelligence, and return to the palace with the information Zalia needed. The stakes were high, and he couldn't afford to fail. As the day wore on, the soldier and his team finally arrived at the first of the rebel camps. The camp was small, hidden deep in the forest, its tents barely visible among the trees. The soldiers moved cautiously, each one staying alert as they crept closer. They had no idea what they would find inside the camp, but the soldier's instincts told him that things weren't going to be as simple as they seemed. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached the camp. The soldier signaled for his team to spread out, each of them taking a position to cover all angles. His heart raced as he thought of Zalia, of the promise he had made to her. He couldn't fail. Not now, not ever. The soldier's breath came in shallow gasps as he crouched behind a large rock, his eyes scanning the rebel camp from the shadows. His team was spread out around the perimeter, their positions carefully chosen to cover every possible escape route. The camp was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the rustle of the trees in the cool breeze and the occasional crackle of a small fire. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. The soldier's heart was racing. He had been preparing for this moment for days, but now that he was here, surrounded by the rebels, the weight of the situation settled on him like a heavy cloak. He had to do this. He had to gather the information they needed to stop the rebellion before it could grow any further. Zalia's kingdom was counting on him. Through the trees, he saw movement. A figure emerged from one of the tents. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, walking with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. The soldier narrowed his eyes. This had to be the rebel leader. The man's face was hard, his eyes sharp and watchful. He was surrounded by a few others, all armed, and their conversation was low, their voices too soft for the soldier to hear clearly. The soldier gestured to his team, signaling for them to hold their positions. He knew they couldn't afford to make a move just yet. They needed more information, something concrete, to take back to Zalia. Minutes passed, like hours. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and making the branches above creak and groan. The soldier's hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He thought of Zalia. Her words from the council chamber still echoed in his mind. "Don't make me regret giving you this chance." He had to prove himself to her. He had to show her that he was more than the man who had fled her side all those years ago. He had to show her that he was capable of more than running away from his mistakes. The rebel leader and his group started to walk toward a small clearing near the camp. The soldier motioned for his team to follow quietly, keeping their movements low and deliberate. As they moved through the trees, they tried to stay out of sight, moving like shadows in the forest. Every step felt heavy, each one bringing them closer to the information they needed. As they neared the clearing, the soldier heard voices, louder now. He signaled for his team to stop and listened closely. The rebel leader was speaking again, but the soldier couldn't quite make out the words. He needed to get closer. The soldier's heart pounded in his chest as he crept forward, moving silently through the underbrush. He was close now, just a few feet away from the group. He could hear their conversation more clearly, but the words were still too muffled to understand. He needed to get even closer. He motioned for one of his soldiers to move into position, a quiet signal to approach from another angle. Together, they would have the perfect vantage point to overhear the entire conversation. They inched closer, moving like ghosts through the trees. The clearing was just ahead, and the soldier could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The moment of truth was fast approaching. He could almost feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. The pressure to succeed, to gather the information, to bring it back to Zalia. The rebel leader's voice became clearer. The soldier heard words like attack, supply routes, and timing. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the information they had been waiting for. "Get the supplies ready," the rebel leader said, his voice low but urgent. "We move at dawn. The humans will be caught off guard. We strike hard and fast, and by the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late." The soldier's mind raced as he processed the information. The rebels were planning an attack. They were preparing to strike at the heart of the kingdom, and they were counting on the element of surprise to give them the upper hand. The soldier's pulse quickened. If they were going to stop this rebellion, they needed to move fast. He turned to his team, signaling for them to fall back. They had what they needed. It was time to go. The mission was a success. They had the intel, and now they could warn Zalia and her forces. But as they turned to leave, a twig snapped underfoot. The soldier's eyes widened in panic. He looked up, and in that moment, he saw the rebel leader's eyes lock onto his. The soldier's heart dropped into his stomach. The rebels had seen them. The element of surprise was gone. Without hesitation, the soldier raised his hand, signaling for his team to move quickly. Fall back, he shouted, but the forest around them erupted into chaos. Shouts rang out as the rebels began to chase them. The soldiers' team scattered, trying to lose their pursuers in the dense woods. The soldier's breath was ragged as he sprinted through the underbrush, his mind racing. They had to make it back to the palace. They had to get the information to Zalia. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring around him as he ran. The sound of footsteps behind him grew louder, and the soldier knew they were gaining on him. He could hear the rebels shouting to one another, their voices getting closer and closer. The soldier's muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Not now. His heart was pounding in his chest, his lungs burning as he pushed himself harder. He could hear the sound of his team moving through the woods ahead of him, but he couldn't afford to look back. His focus was on one thing and one thing only: getting to the palace, getting the intel to Zalia. The soldier pushed through a thick patch of brush, and suddenly he found himself in a small clearing. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a group of rebels ahead, blocking his escape route. He cursed under his breath and turned to his team, signaling for them to split up and take a different route. They had no time to waste. They had to get away. Without thinking, the soldier pulled out his weapon and fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off the rebels. But they didn't hesitate. They charged forward, weapons raised. The soldier's instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind a large tree, narrowly avoiding the rebels' shots. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, his mind moving in overdrive as he calculated his next move. He had to think fast. They couldn't afford to be caught here. He signaled for his team to regroup, and together they darted into the trees, weaving between the trunks to avoid being seen. They were moving quickly now, trying to outrun the rebels who were hot on their trail. The soldier could hear the shouts of the rebels getting fainter as they moved deeper into the forest. His heart was still racing, but he allowed himself a moment to breathe. They had escaped, for now. As they made their way back toward the palace, the soldier's mind replayed the events of the day. The information they had gathered was crucial. Zalia needed to know about the rebel attack, and they needed to move quickly to stop it. But as he looked around at his team, he realized that the mission wasn't over. The rebels weren't going to give up so easily. The soldier had no doubt that they would come after them. Again, and this time, they would be ready. When they finally returned to the palace, the soldier was exhausted, but relieved. They had made it back with the information they needed. But he knew that the real battle was still ahead. Zalia had given him a chance to prove himself. Now, he had to make sure he didn't fail.